On December 8, 1980, New York was moving the way New York always moves, fast, indifferent, restless. Outside the Dakota building on the Upper West Side, people came and went under the winter air, unaware that in a few minutes one of the most famous men on earth would be lying on the pavement. John Lennon had spent the day doing what looked like the beginning of a return. A photo session, interviews, studio work, ordinary movement inside an extraordinary life. He had once changed popular music with the Beatles, then challenged politics, fame, and even the meaning of celebrity itself. But that night, none of that history seemed to protect him. When the gunshots came, they did not just hit a musician. They shattered a generation's sense that certain voices were too important to be silenced. The news spread with the speed of disbelief. Radio stations interrupted programming. Television anchors struggled to keep their voices steady. People heard the words and rejected them on instinct. John Lennon had been shot. John Lennon was dead. In apartments, taxis, bars, and dorm rooms, the same stunned pause followed. Because Lennon did not belong to one country, one decade, or even one band anymore. He belonged to the global imagination. He was the sharp wit of Liverpool, the rebel heart of the Beatles, the man who wrote Imagine, the artist who turned love, anger, peace, and contradiction into cultural force. His death was not processed as celebrity news. It felt personal, almost unreal, as if history itself had just been interrupted outside a Manhattan apartment building. And that is what makes the story begin not with music, but with rupture. How does a boy from wartime Liverpool become one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, only to die by violence at the moment he seemed ready to speak again? Why did John Lennon, of all people, have to end as a crime scene before he could become an old legend? To answer that, we have to go back before New York, before Yoko, before Imagine, before Beatlemania shook the world. We have to return to Liverpool, to a childhood shaped by absence, anger, humor, and the first fragile notes of a life that would one day become louder than the century around it.
John Lennon was born in Liverpool in 1940, in the middle of war, when air raid sirens and uncertainty were part of daily life. But the deeper instability in his life came not only from history, it came from home. His parents' relationship fractured early, and John grew up between absences, divided loyalties, and emotional confusion he was too young to name. He was eventually raised by his Aunt Mimi, whose house offered structure, rules, and discipline, while his mother Julia remained a magnetic, complicated presence just outside the center of his life. That split shaped him deeply. Even as a boy, John learned that love could be real and still unreliable, that affection could come wrapped in distance, and that humor could protect you when security failed. Those contradictions never really left him. At school, he was clever, sarcastic, difficult, and impossible to ignore. Teachers saw talent, but also defiance. He drew well, mocked authority, and developed the sharp edge that would later become one of his defining traits. But underneath the attitude was a boy already learning how to turn pain into personality. Music entered not as fame, but as rescue. Through Julia, he discovered records, rhythm, and the thrill of American rock and roll. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, these weren't just artists to him. They were proof that emotion could be transformed into sound and rebellion into style. Julia taught him chords, brought warmth and danger into the same room, and opened the door to a world that felt larger than Liverpool. In many ways, she gave him music before life took her away. That loss would become one of the deepest wounds of his life. When Julia died after being struck by a car, John was still young, and the shock cut straight through whatever emotional defenses he had already built. It is impossible to understand Lennon's later anger, tenderness, insecurity, and hunger for connection without understanding that moment. By then, however, another force had already begun forming inside him. He had a guitar. He had jokes sharp enough to hide behind. He had an instinct for performance and a restless need to be heard. Before the world knew his name, John Lennon was already becoming himself, wounded, brilliant, defensive, funny, and full of noise. Liverpool did not give him peace, but it gave him raw material. And from that raw material, he would begin building something that could one day shake the world. The first version of John Lennon's revolution did not begin in a stadium. It began in small rooms, cheap instruments, and the stubborn belief that music could become escape, identity, and power at the same time. In Liverpool, John formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen, and in 1957 he met Paul McCartney, a meeting that would alter the course of modern culture. George Harrison followed, then long nights of playing, failing, learning, and tightening their sound in front of crowds that owed them nothing. Hamburg hardened them. Liverpool sharpened them. By the time they took the stage at the Cavern Club, they were no longer boys imitating American rock and roll. They were becoming something original, faster, funnier, more dangerous, more alive. And at the center of it all was Lennon. Rawer than Paul, rougher at the edges, carrying both swagger and damage in the same voice. He was not the polished face of the group. He was its voltage. Then the explosion came. Beatlemania was not just popularity, it was mass cultural detonation. The Beatles became the sound, style, and emotional tempo of a generation that suddenly wanted something brighter and louder than the world that came before it. Crowds screamed, headlines multiplied, airport runways turned into scenes of hysteria. And as the fame accelerated, John Lennon became one of the most recognizable men on Earth. Yet even inside a band built on unity, he remained distinct. There was wit in him, but also bite. Charm, but also impatience. Songs like A Hard Day's Night, Help, Norwegian Wood, and later Strawberry Fields Forever revealed a mind moving beyond simple pop triumph. Lennon was not only writing hits, he was beginning to turn inner confusion, memory, sarcasm, longing, and experimentation into music the world had never quite heard before. The Beatles were becoming bigger than entertainment, and Lennon was one of the main reasons why. He brought friction. He brought edge. He made sure the band never sounded entirely comfortable inside its own success. As the 1960s deepened, so did Lennon's ambition. The Beatles stopped being just a touring phenomenon and became an artistic engine, reshaping what albums, lyrics, and studio sound could be. Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and The White Album were not merely records, they were signals that popular music had entered a new age. John's role in that transformation was essential. He could be brutally honest, emotionally exposed, absurdly funny, and artistically restless, often within the same song. The world saw 4 Beatles, but it increasingly felt Lennon as a kind of emotional center of gravity. Unpredictable, brilliant, sometimes reckless, always impossible to ignore. Yet success at that level creates a dangerous illusion that being adored by millions can heal what was broken before the applause began. It cannot. By the end of the decade, John Lennon had become one of the most famous human beings alive. But fame had not made him whole. It had only made the next transformation unavoidable. By the end of the 1960s, John Lennon was no longer content being only 1/4 of the biggest band in history. The Beatles had changed music, but success on that scale can become its own kind of cage. Inside the band, old balances were breaking down, creative tensions sharpened, business pressures increased. Fame, once exhilarating, had become exhausting and unnatural. And then came Yoko Ono. To the public, she was often framed as disruption. To Lennon, she was liberation. With Yoko, he found not only a partner but a new artistic language, one that was more experimental, more confrontational, more personal, and less interested in pleasing the world. For a man who had spent most of the decade inside the machinery of Beatlemania, that shift was enormous. John was no longer trying to be the clever Beatle with the sharpest tongue. He was trying to become fully himself, even if the result made people uncomfortable. The breakup of the Beatles did not shrink Lennon. It exposed him. His solo work stripped away the collective shield of the band and replaced it with confession, rage, vulnerability, and politics. Songs like Mother, Working Class Hero, and later, Imagine, revealed a man trying to rebuild identity in public. This was not pop stardom in its safest form. It was raw self-examination mixed with a growing belief that music could intervene in the world beyond entertainment. Lennon and Yoko turned love into performance art, staging bed-ins for peace and using fame as a weapon against war and passivity. In the era of Vietnam, student protest, state violence, and generational fracture, John Lennon was no longer merely writing songs for the soundtrack of youth. He was stepping directly into the political imagination of the age. That shift made him influential in a completely new way, but also dangerous in the eyes of those who preferred their celebrities harmless. And danger, in Lennon's case, did not remain abstract. The U.S. government monitored him. The Nixon administration saw his anti-war activism and public visibility as a potential threat, especially to young voters and the protest generation. Immigration battles followed. Surveillance cast a shadow over his years in America. But even under pressure, Lennon kept pushing outward, turning the personal into the political and the political back into art. By the early 1970s, he had transformed from Beatle to symbol, not just of music, but of dissent, reinvention, and the refusal to remain frozen in one role forever. Yet reinvention has a cost. The more he escaped the image the world loved, the more complicated his life became. John Lennon had outgrown the band that made him immortal. Now he had to live with what came after immortality: scrutiny, fragmentation, and the burden of being taken seriously in a world that first learned to scream his name. By the late 1970s, John Lennon had largely stepped back from the public machine that had once consumed him. He became quieter, more domestic, more absorbed in private life with Yoko Ono and their son Sean. For a man who had lived under the pressure of global obsession since his early 20s, this retreat looked almost unbelievable. The headlines faded. The constant political heat cooled. For a while, John Lennon seemed less like the former Beatle who had shaken the world, and more like a husband, a father, a man trying to reclaim something ordinary. Yet that silence was never permanent. It was a pause. And by 1980, the pause was ending. He was writing again, recording again, and speaking with the energy of someone who had rediscovered purpose rather than simply resumed work. That return took shape in Double Fantasy, an album that felt intimate, adult, and strangely hopeful. It did not sound like a man trapped in nostalgia. It sounded like a man opening a new chapter. On December 8, 1980, Lennon moved through a day that now feels unbearable in hindsight, because it seemed so full of life. He took part in a photo session with Annie Leibovitz. He gave interviews. He went to the record plant studio with Yoko. Earlier, outside the Dakota, he even signed an album for a fan waiting near the entrance. A moment frozen forever in photographs that would later become chilling. Nothing in the public rhythm of that day suggested finality. If anything, it suggested renewal. John Lennon was 40 years old, no longer the reckless young revolutionary, but not finished, not fading, not gone. Then came the return home. Near the entrance of the Dakota that night, shots were fired and the future collapsed in seconds. Lennon was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The shock spread almost instantly through New York and then across the world. What made the event so devastating was not only the violence, but the timing. He had not died at the end of a long public decline. He had died at the threshold of another beginning. That is why December 8, 1980 still feels suspended in history, not simply as the night John Lennon was murdered, but as the night a voice preparing to speak again was cut off in the doorway of its own return. John Lennon's death ended a life, but it did not end his presence. In the years that followed, his voice remained everywhere. In record stores, in political marches, in films, in memorials, in the private grief of people who had never met him and yet felt they had lost someone intimate. That is the strange scale of Lennon's legacy. He was not only remembered as a former Beatle or a famous songwriter, but as a figure who had come to represent imagination itself. Songs like Imagine moved beyond pop music and became global symbols of longing, hope, and contradiction. They were played at memorials, peace events, public tributes, and moments of world crisis, as if Lennon's words had escaped the decade that made them and entered a permanent human vocabulary. But what makes his legacy so powerful is that it was never simple. John Lennon was brilliant, funny, wounded, provocative, loving, difficult, idealistic, and often contradictory. He could write tenderness and violence into the same life. He could speak of peace while carrying private chaos. And perhaps that is why he lasts. Perfect icons often become statues. Lennon remained human enough to stay alive in culture. He did not survive because he was flawless. He survived because he was unforgettable, because he turned his damage, humor, politics, and longing into art that still feels unfinished every time someone presses play. Today, people still gather at Strawberry Fields in Central Park, still leave flowers, guitars, notes, and silence. The spot is not just a memorial. It is proof that some artists do not stay inside their time. They keep moving through other people's lives. John Lennon was killed in 1980, but the voice did not disappear with the man. It remained in the songs, in the arguments, in the dream of peace, in the memory of rebellion, and in the idea that art can still challenge the world long after the artist is gone. They stopped his body outside the Dakota. They never stopped the echo.